Hello and welcome everyone to the 5th plenary panel of the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism entitled Racialized Representation in Student Governance and Leadership. I just wanted to say Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be unto you in my community. We greet each other and say goodbye in the same way in order to begin and end conversations with love, ensuring a sense of community between members of our conversation here today. And so I welcome everyone into this space with that intention. Moving forward, prior to beginning this session, there are a few things that must be noted in the same spirit of collegiality. There's a conversation to be instigated around not being invited to reside on the land that we currently live on. Though I am the child of immigrants, my parents and theirs didn't by any means receive permission to settle in this land. And though our family for generations lived in another land, the one I currently call home is not in fact my own, nor am I historically a caretaker of it as Indigenous peoples are. When my parents and theirs received their citizenship, at that time they were ecstatic in being able to call themselves Canadian, a concept discussed in yesterday's plenary panel number 1 surrounding nationalistic principles that wind through immigration processes. As if the papers that they were provided meant more than providing one access to that which was not theirs. And I come from a family of farmers in Pakistan, and so our land means quite a lot to us, having been passed through generations, and being aware of our land with traditionally our own land being taken care of is to be respectful to our ancestors who passed along the role of vitality for our land and of our land for those of us who still reside there and those of us who may have migrated abroad. I currently live on the land of the Haudenosaunees and the Mississaugas of the Credit Valley, traditionally the land of the Wendat. This land is under 3 treaties, Treaty 13, the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and the Williams Treaty. Though these particular tribes were named, this is also land that many Indigenous tribes have walked and traveled through, including those who have not yet laid their roots here, as well as those who have laid their roots here but were elsewhere at some other time. I also like to acknowledge the relationships that we've cultivated between ourselves as well as the land caretaken by those peoples, as this is an important part of our presence on the land to encourage those relationships as well. Since this is a forum on higher education as well, I would like to encourage folks in lectures and who are conducting lectures to put together reading lists and sort of include more Indigenous and BIPOC authors in reading lists with information regarding those individuals from those communities into opening remarks for class. That could take the result of increasingly informative land acknowledgements that provide sort of more information about what those land acknowledgements mean for individuals who may not have come across them and are entering the higher education space for the first time. I know personally those of us who attend class and those of us who don't would benefit from broadening our areas of understanding into scholars that provide alternative methods of data dissemination. Alternatively, in the spirit of gift giving, I suppose, because the gift giving season is upon us, I would suggest and encourage folks to support Indigenous small businesses. Some such businesses include the Hazelwood Shop and the Iron Dog Books Shop, which are great areas of support I myself have drawn on. And there are any number of them that you folks can look into with a basic Google search. Some great novels to look into that aren't as dense and academic that folks might turn away from include Living on Stolen Land by Ambeline Quay Molina, or This Place, 150 Years Retold by a collection of authors such as Sunny Asu and Jen Storm. My apologies. The space that we have here today is and will continue to remain safe and inclusive for everyone currently within this virtual room, as well as beyond. By participating in this event, you are agreeing to hold on to the values that I'm about to discuss and emphasize. First and foremost, we need to acknowledge that starting points for everyone are different, and we need to acknowledge our historical and divisive biases in coming into conversations surrounding equity. We hope that everyone will continue to treat their fellow attendees with dignity and respect, trusting that everyone has come to the forum in order to learn, grow, and share. Please enter these spaces with a growth mindset and be open to learning, as we should be recognizing that the best way to understand the choices, actions, or intentions of others is by asking questions. We also want to ensure that through this session, though we may be speaking about heavy conversations as have been discussed throughout the forum, which can be impactful to our mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical well-being, that it is okay to ask for help or support. And my final sort of note with regards to the opening remarks here is that many of us tend to take care of others as community-based communities. We lack caring for ourselves. And so if anyone needs to log off or move away from the conversations we're having at this forum, it's completely understandable, and your well-being comes before anything else. Today's plenary panel centers on the topics of racialized representation in student governance and leadership. Much of the conversation had here today will be uniquely placed in the forum. This is especially so because we have with us a very small but very impactful group of students who are heavily involved in the student-facing realm. A lot of higher education is, of course, relating to faculty and to staff, but the institution would never exist without the voices of students who breathe life into schooling, student experiences, and often lobby for change for the betterment of each group previously mentioned. Today, we hope to gain an understanding about what relation racialized experiences have with the endeavor to engage significantly with the portion of higher education that uses universities as a pit stop on the way to the rest of their lives. My name is Natasha. My pronouns are she and her. I am currently a master's student at York University in political science, as well as a recent grad from X University. I myself have been intimately involved within the student governance arena for the better part of my undergraduate experience. I've held positions including the vice president operations of my own former student society in the Faculty of Arts at X University. I will be moderating the discussion between our panelists today. Today we are joined by 4 engaged and accomplished student leaders who have contributed to the student experience and wider university experience significantly. And on that note, I'm going to turn to our panelists to give us some insight into their experiences. And so panelists, folks, alongside a short introduction, can you folks tell us a little bit about how and why you got involved with student governance and how your experience as a racialized student has impacted your journey to involvement? I'll pass the virtual floor along to Alex first, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Rana. I'm a third-year student at the University of Manitoba, and I'm doing an honors degree in English and linguistics. On campus, I am involved in a variety of different groups. I'm currently the president of the University One Student Council and the Racialized Community Representative for the Arts Student Body Council, and I'm a student ambassador for the Faculty of Arts. Aside from that, I hold positions in some clubs related to my major, such as English Film and Theater Student Association and the Linguistic Integrated Student Hub, and I'm the managing editor for the campus literary magazine. In terms of student governance, I was always interested in being involved, and when I started university, I kind of noticed that there were things around campus that I wish could be changed or new initiatives that I thought would be good to implement. And I figured that instead of hoping for someone else to feel the same way and take on those tasks, I would see if I could get involved myself and do those things and hope to make change. In terms of being a racialized student and the impact that has had on my student involvement, I think that during high school, it was definitely a challenge to being involved because I was one of only 3 racialized students in my whole grade. And I was always kind of viewed as other, despite having a similar background and upbringing to everyone else in my school. And so once I got to university, I saw there was a large community of other students there who were racialized as well. And I felt that it was kind of a fresh start for me and that I could feel more empowered to take on leadership roles. And it's been good overall in terms of helping me find a sense of belonging and camaraderie with my fellow students.
Thank you, Alex, for those insights. Your ideas surrounding the implementation of initiatives that you took on yourself in order to be that change maker for other people at your university is incredibly valid and quite amazing to go from a high school experience where you were one of few racialized folks and then to move into university where you are one of many. I think that's definitely a huge change and a huge shock for many people when they go through that kind of experience. And so I applaud you for that. Brenden, can I get your insights into this as well, along with an introduction, just an insight into how and why you got involved and what that journey has been like?
Definitely, yeah. Thanks, Natasha, for moderating this panel first off. And so for me, my name is Brenden Gali. I use he, him pronouns. I'm coming also from Winnipeg, Manitoba. I originally attended the University of Winnipeg. And so on where we are at, I guess, we are traditionally we're on Treaty 1 territory, which is the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the OG Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. I've been, I guess, I've been to a few of these sort of conversations where we've also talked about where we were, and it's important that when speaking about this land, that we also acknowledge that where we get our water from is from Shoal Lake Band 40, which is Treaty 3, and how I'm connecting with you folks today over the internet and the technology that we're using. We actually get our power from Treaty 5, from hydro plants up north in Manitoba. So that's something that I feel is important to bring up in spaces like these as well. And when also thinking about the lands, my brain doesn't necessarily like to compartmentalize things. I do believe that things are intertwined in so many different ways. I grew up in Winnipeg. I currently live in the West End. I grew up maybe 5 minutes west, just down Portage Avenue, which is one of our main roads in the city, in St. James. And I decided to go to school in the University of Winnipeg, which is 20 minutes east down Portage Avenue, sits right on Portage Avenue. And I started university actually in 2011, which I realize now is 10 years ago. And I actually originally wanted to just get involved. I was a pretty spry young person, just wanting to see what was out there and what I could get involved with. And I first started out just by volunteering for my student union, the UWSA. A few years later, I decided to be a director. I took 2 years off of the university. When I came back, I got a job with my student union. And then a year after that, I was asked to run as an executive. And that running as an executive was my first sort of insight into the whole inner workings of student movement, student government, student leadership. I've never really considered myself a student leader. I don't like, I think people can maybe tell by the discomfort in speaking that I don't necessarily want to be speaking all the time. But more, I think of myself as like community support and community helper. I like to be in the rear and just sort of like help people find their paths in these circles to seek out that leadership and make those changes. Anyways, to just summarize the whole experience, I ended up serving 2 years as an executive with my student union, and after that, served as the chairperson for the Canadian Federation of Students of Manitoba for 2 terms. I'm currently working as an arts administrator in Winnipeg for a gallery in Winnipeg called Graffiti Art Gallery, as well as a gallery space called Take Home BIPOC Arts House, an art space that we just opened up in Winnipeg that serves BIPOC artists in Manitoba, as well as across Turtle Island. So that's just a little bit about me. Can't wait to get more into this conversation. So thanks for the time.
Thank you, Brenden, so much. Your points about where we receive our water and technology is very, very important. And your energy and volunteering and sort of moving your way through involvement, holding jobs and running as in executive positions is a sort of maze of involvement. And that's interesting to meander through for sure, especially with your note about helping students find their path. I know from personal experience and having mentors in student involvement as well that support is so very valuable and necessary for folks who are moving through university, for some folks who are the first individuals in their family to engage with higher education as well. Deb, over to you.
Thanks so much, Natasha. Hi, everyone. My name is Deborah Lim, Ling Ziela Lamgit Long. I was born in Singapore, grew up in California, and I currently reside in Toronto in the District 1 Spoon Treaty, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. I'm so happy to be sharing this space today with Natasha, Alex, Brenden, and Molly. What an incredible group of leaders. I myself am a professional production manager, the general manager of Fujian Theater Company. I am also a second-year law student at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law, and I serve currently as the Vice President of Social and External Affairs on the Lincoln Alexander Students Society. While I have had a lot of experience in leadership, this is my first time on student government. I stepped into office in May, and so I've only been in this role for about 6 months now. I feel like I should backtrack a little bit and just position myself in my school. My school is a brand new school, and I am very fortunate to be part of the first cohort. And so because of that, last year, during the very first year of the school, I co-founded the Asia Pacific Law Students Association. And while we were really pleased with what we accomplished in the year, I also felt like we had some pain points that was shared not just among our association, but among many other student organizations. And that was the impetus for me to run for student government to try and address these pain points. And in terms of my experience as a racialized student and how it got to my journey in involvement is, I think I have a background in performing arts. And so I'm very, very intimately familiar with rejection. You know, you go out and you audition for I don't know how many pieces, and you maybe like get cast into 5 or 10% of all of the auditions you attend. And so because of that, I've never been afraid of putting myself out there, because that was the only way I ever got into those roles, into that 5 or 10%. And so I have been someone who's always just been trying to create my own space and pave roads. And so yeah, that's why I put myself out there. I co-founded the Asia Pacific Law Students Association, and why I'm now here on student government.
Thank you so much, Deb. Your experience is so unique, especially with the fact that the Lincoln Alexander School of Law is so new at X University. And because of all of those shifting geopolitical locations and all of your experience, you have been able to create new spaces for new groups and identify those kinds of growing pains that you mentioned as well. And in mentioning your experience with rejection, I hope that's something that's built your confidence in putting yourself out there. I really, really admire that, because I know that coming to terms with that kind of rejection is very, very difficult. Molly, can I ask you to jump in here?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Molly Burke. I'm a third-year student at St. FX University. I'm an Indigenous student as well. St. FX is located on traditional Mi'kmaq territory. I am the student union's Indigenous representative. I've been the Indigenous representative for 2 years now, as well as being part of the Indigenous Society, and working with the library on making the library more accessible for Indigenous students. I got involved because there was little to no representation in the university for Indigenous students. There was nothing going on, and there was no one there to show other Indigenous students that, you know, you could have a position here and you do belong at the school. So I wanted to show other Indigenous students that it is possible to, you know, be a part of the student union and do these great things. And yeah, that's kind of why I got involved. My experience has gone really well. I had a really rough year, my first year at the university. I was taken away from my family for the first time. I didn't have the community that I used to have. And I faced a lot of racism as well, which I wasn't used to because I grew up in such a loving place where everyone was very integrated. So getting involved at the Indigenous Center really helped me branch out and become more confident in who I am as an Indigenous woman and just a student in general. So it has been a really great experience getting involved with the Students' Union. They have helped me be so much more comfortable with who I am, and I love sharing my background and my pride in being an Indigenous woman.
Thank you so much, Molly. Being in that kind of position for 2 years back to back and holding so many accessibility notions and positions that sort of create those spaces that Deb was mentioning earlier as well for people of your identity to sort of feel at home and feel that sense of community, because as you mentioned, being taken out of your own community from such a loving place and being thrown into a completely new community where you don't have those same kinds of supports, it's incredibly jarring and it's hard to get involved in that way as well. But I'm glad to see that you managed it very, very well and that you feel at home with your community on campus. And thank you folks for sharing. Thank you so much. Now, I know that sometimes, all of that being said, in the general mechanisms of the university, student leaders are often underestimated quite a bit. You folks, whether elected or appointed, hold quite a bit of power, not only over the dollar value of some things, depending on your position, but also as being representatives, and as Molly was mentioning earlier, as being representatives of your particular community and visible representatives in some cases as well, and representing that power. So my feeler question here is with regards to that sort of pressure. Now, do you feel pressure to be representative of all people belonging to your identity? And I know Molly and Alex, you folks are a bit unique in that you hold positions that specifically reference being a racialized or holding positions relating to your identity. So I'd love it if you folks could speak to that pressure. Can I ask? Now, Alex began last time. Molly, is it all right if I ask you to continue the conversation here?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely felt the pressure my first year, and I still do a bit too. Everyone's being Indigenous, you feel like you have to fit in a certain box of what to look like, what to know, how to act, what to tell other people. And it's not like that at all, because it's so different. The experience is so different for each and every one of us. And I felt especially, I'm not Mi'kmaq myself, I'm Maliseet coming on Mi'kmaq territory. I felt like I was taking an opportunity from another student, but when I came there and I went to the center, I was so accepted by everybody, and they were all so happy to have me there, and I've learned so much about the Mi'kmaq culture itself. Yeah, I constantly feel the pressure to have to speak for everyone, for all of our experiences, and that's not the case because each of our experiences are so different. I work alongside another Indigenous student on the union, and we try to communicate as much as possible with all the other Indigenous students there to let the union know what's actually going on and what our problems are and what needs to be changed and what needs to be celebrated. So that's kind of one of the ways that we've managed to work around that pressure of feeling like I have to speak for everyone. And yeah, that's the best that I can do.
No, that was amazing. Thank you so much. It's definitely, and what I'm getting from what you're saying is that there is definitely that pressure that's there to speak and that you hold that kind of position. But you've managed to sort of bring in that aspect of community that you were chatting about earlier as well, and sort of create and emphasize that you're not a monolith, and that no one is really a monolith, and everyone has varying experiences that they bring to the table, and so emphasizing that for sure. Alex, can we jump to you, please?
Yeah, I definitely feel similar to a lot of what Molly was saying in my role as racialized representative, which is not just representing South Asian or Asian students, but every racialized group, which is kind of, there is a lot of pressure that comes along with that. It's definitely a daunting task and role to take on. And sometimes I also do feel that maybe it should be given to somebody else. Like I'm taking away a role that could be given to another racialized student or someone who's more racialized, which is like kind of just how I feel growing up. like being born and raised in North America and not like personally not having a very intense connection to my background, I'm like, maybe I'm not the best person for that role. Yeah, I think that's kind of a mindset that taking on that role creates, because you you're always having to consider what you want may be different from what your own community wants, and then what other racialized communities want. And so for me, I've been trying to talk to people I know, like run things by them, also who are in my own community and other communities, when I'm trying to create initiatives for those, and make sure that it's obviously you can't do exactly what every single person wants, but just considering the input of others has been helpful to kind of mitigate that feeling.
Yeah, for sure. And that goes back to a lot of what Molly was saying earlier as well, in that you're creating that sort of space to ensure that we're not considered a monolith. Coming from a similar community, I'm also South Asian, so it's very clear that everyone has their own opinions about what is right and what matters to their community. And so the fact that you folks are all talking to people and bringing people together, and rather than bringing people together, bringing forward the concerns of each individual community that you've been chatting with, because that's super important, especially in bringing forward, change and the kinds of things that each community wants to see. And just a note for any of the panelists that I haven't been mentioning, don't feel free to jump in whenever you'd like. We're going for a flow in this conversation. I'm not your professor, so feel free to jump in wherever. Deb, I know your student group is uniquely placed in this particular conversation because you are mostly racialized students, and you sort of hold a different kind of experience. So I'd like to sort of shift the question. Does that sort of alleviate pressures of having to represent your background, if those kinds of pressures exist for you?
Yes, absolutely. So a bit about my student organization, government. There's 5 executives and 4 of us are visibly racialized. And not only that, but I'm also very fortunate to be at a school where I would say the majority of our administration are visibly racialized women. And so I don't feel a pressure to be representative, and I don't want to be a representative for, like Southeast Asian or just Asian people generally, or racialized people. That's so much stress to take on, as Alex and Molly have alluded to. And I am an elected in an elected position, so I do already have the pressure of representing the student body at large. And so that comes with my job, and that's something that I do take on. But in terms of representing the Asian student body, for example, I mentioned that there is now an Asian Law Students Association. At our school, we also have an Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council, which is made up of representatives from all of our equity-seeking associations. So there's a lot of avenues for racialized students to be represented and have their concerns and their interests advocated for. And so that's not something that I've taken on myself in my role on student government.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Deb. It's amazing to me that most of the admin are visibly racialized women or visibly racialized folks. In mentioning that you don't feel that pressure and don't want to be a representative of your own particular identity and that sort. That's very powerful, because I think that what Molly and Alex were mentioning is that kind of responsibility is very heavy and very weighty. And so a lot of the times, and what I wanted to point to with that question is that a lot of the times students who select to participate in student governance and student leadership they're not taken as seriously in that position because they're students. But what we want to focus on in this panel is the fact that these students impact significantly the experience of other students that look like them in those positions of power. I also happen to have, when I was involved, I was a part of an organization that hadn't had a visibly hijabi Muslim South Asian woman in a position of power. And we had quite a hefty sum of money on our hands to deal with budgets and such. And so it was a lot of responsibility for me to not only be in those positions of having to have my face plastered up in places, but also have to represent the student body in an online format that I perhaps had not been able to meet everyone, you know? So, and I'm sure that that's some parts of that are things that everyone on this little panel here can relate to with regards to what Molly and Deb and Alex have been sharing. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add to that question to close this up and move forward? No. All right. On the topic of EDI then, which Deb, you'd mentioned with regards to councils being put together so that racialized students can sort of go to those places and advocate for themselves in those avenues. Those kinds of EDI and equity and the visibility of those racialized students, we're often placed at the forefront of that sort of identity tokenization, in the fact that we're plastered in places and told like, that person can do it, so can you. Now, should student associations and student governments and student groups intentionally create, and again, I know that we're in a unique position here where half of us are on and specifically relating to those EDI and race-based positions, but should student groups sort of intentionally create EDI and race-based positions for community inclusion, and what sorts of challenges and opportunities are presented in doing so? Wow. I'm gonna reach for support on this question. Brenden, if you wouldn't mind taking us away.
Totally. Okay. Yeah, this one is such just on my mind so often, EDI. And by no means do I like speaking about this subject in a way that like is divisive and that there's one side and there's another side. I think it is a lot more complicated than that. And I think it's in the implementation of how EDI policies are done, and whether that's at a institutional level, or if it's at the student union alone, or even within a student group. The piece of EDI that I take most, I guess, like caution with is the inclusion aspect of it. I'm more of a train of thought that when you're an elected person in a position of power, whether that's as a student or as an administrator at a university or a college, you got to recognize the position that you are holding, and that oftentimes is, if we're to draw that out, like you'd be at the top, right? We talk about bottom-up approaches when it comes to leadership, and how we would think that we're like everyone else, and I'm that cool leader that I'm just like you. But the reality is you do hold institutional power, and so to recognize that first, I think of that word inclusion, and it's really hard to reach out to those students who are, whether that's racialized students who have access to like financial barriers and are maybe in need of care for dependents that they're taking care of, or are facing issues of housing. When there's so many other barriers that they are thinking about, the idea of inclusion is just sort of, in my mind, it just seems like another chore that, okay, now should I get involved with my student union as well? And so what I often think about when I hold positions of power is more, how do I engage with these students and meeting them where they're at? Because we can like put out as many invitations as we want. When I was working for the Canadian Federation of Students, saying, come to our office, that rarely works. So that's why, tabling is just one really easy thing to do when you're working as a student representative of any kind. Is to just meet students who are just going class to class and just explaining what you do and who you are and how you can help. And then also explaining just the opportunities or the fun things that they can participate in, games night, and starting off at a medium that they can just create a base fundamental relationship with you, and then hopefully piquing their interest in those other areas, when it comes to student governance. And maybe they didn't know that they had interest in that, but meeting them at a level that they can understand. I don't want to be condescending about it, but meeting them, speaking to them in language that they want to speak to or with you about. You can create really cool avenues of mentorship that, again, creates those pathways to these roles that we sort of all have. And so, yeah, when I think about EDI, it's that inclusion component that really just like kind of bothers me. And I think many organizations miss the mark on because they host an event at their site or, wherever their offices are, the space that they have to throw events. Just these university spaces are just so large, and as well as the communities that universities sit on. University of Winnipeg is in urban center of Winnipeg, and there's so many different cool things going on, and it's I think about just getting out of your bubble and seeing what the different student groups are doing and going to their events, because sometimes I've thrown events in the past and like we thought they were so cool and like heck yeah. And then it was like no one showed up. It's like, yeah, because they're doing way cooler stuff over there. And like, I want to go to that party. So I'm, making a point to showing up for the people that are doing the work as well. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's an excellent point, especially in the fact that EDI and inclusion oftentimes, especially in student groups, and maybe because we're new to this concept as well, we're not able to include everyone and provide access to absolutely everyone on campus, especially through the avenues that you'd mentioned, in that sometimes there are class access issues, and sometimes people just genuinely are not interested. And so we need to create those avenues of inclusion that interest them rather than interest us, or we think that would interest them, so that we're actually relating to the folks that we're trying to reach out to. And especially to your point about institutional power, which is something that in student government, at least, I definitely would notice that in that representative presidents, vice presidents, etc., just through their title, hold that sort of power when they introduce themselves in a conversation like, hi, I'm X, president of Y. It's like, oh, okay, like this is a person that's entering a conversation that holds power that now we have to sort of interact with. So I always found it very interesting. And just a random tidbit before we continue, that my former president of my organization never introduced herself as president. She would always say, hi, this is my name, these are my pronouns, and then continue the conversation. And so that sort of just emphasized that trying to relate to students and being like, no, I might be president, but like, I also have class, I also have work, I'm also trying to juggle all of access to things myself. So I'm just trying to be a student like you. And I just so happen to be privileged enough, which is a concept we're going to be talking about later, to be able to hold this position of power. Now, I'd like to facilitate, Alex, your entry into this question, because I know that you hold a position that's specifically, as we mentioned earlier, race or diaspora or based, I suppose. Can you give us an insight into what challenges and opportunities that you've had in this particular arena, please?
Yeah, I definitely also agree with what you were saying earlier about I feel the same way about introducing myself. Like, I don't really consider myself like a student leader or anything, which I know Brenden said in his introduction. Yeah, so I think an opportunity that comes with roles like this, and I noticed this like in both my role as a racialized representative and in my other leadership roles that are not focused on that, it gives it definitely allows for more initiatives and like events and stuff specifically geared towards racialized students or other like equity seeking students for other ADI roles. It like allows more of those to happen for sure, because there's a person who's dedicated just to that and who's has the time for it, which like in my role as president of my other student council, like I would like to see those things happen, but I definitely don't have time to do that type of stuff, which is why I find it helpful to have community rep positions, so those things do get done. And it also gives the opportunity for newer student leaders, well, I don't really like that word, but newer students who are not really familiar with student governance, I think that's a good position, and it attracts a lot of people who it's their first time getting involved, and they're not really wanting to run for like president or anything yet, but it provides a good introduction to student governance, and it gives a chance for their voices to be heard. And I think some of the challenges are, like I've said earlier, you're representing a whole community in those positions, which is full of like varying ideas and different groups of people who don't necessarily want the same thing, and some of them don't really even care about what you're doing. Like Brenden said, like sometimes people don't even show up to the events. And personally, another struggle I've kind of dealt with in my role as racialized rep is I've had like other students and people who are kind of my friends like tell me, oh, it's just a performative role, you don't really do anything, which is kind of disheartening to hear, but I do know that people do see those roles that way, because there is sometimes where people create these roles and they are just for their image. They don't really listen to the students in those roles. They don't really give them power to make change for their community. And so I've been trying to focus in my role on like proving the people who said that to me wrong. And I'm like, no, I actually do things. And yeah, so those are the challenges that I've kind of dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of those are 100% valid. I think that that's the concept of that EDI roles are just there for the image is something that a lot of people say, and it is really disheartening, especially for those of us who actually want to get involved but don't see avenues to get involved other than those racialized positions that are quote unquote made for us, so to speak. But then again, like you mentioned, the challenge there is representing a whole community. But I mean, there are positives and perks that you pointed to as well, which I think are definitely worth like recapping a little bit, that you get to, sort of relate to racialized students and mentor them as well, because it is an avenue of an entry to student governance, especially because a lot of people wouldn't think of like, a committee member for marketing or committee member for community relations or corporate relations, that sort of thing. That's not really something that immediately grabs at people and they're like, oh my gosh, I belong there. Like vice president having been in operations, my committee members often, there were very few that would apply for my positions. And so most of them would gravitate towards positions that they would think, okay, like this seems like something that I could actually make a difference in doing. And I suppose that's also an aspect of student involvement that people can bring in. Now, Deb, we mentioned earlier that you came from a group that is predominantly, again, racialized, which is, again, a very interesting experience to say the least. But what are your thoughts regarding this?
So I think the question, should student associations and groups intentionally create EDI positions? I want to say yes, but I think, yes, they are important positions, but they must be implemented thoughtfully and meaningfully, because if they aren't, then you just risk perpetuating tokenism and racism, and that is the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. And I think, as Alex has already talked about, like a lot of times these positions, it's just like it's one person in the role, and it's so much work, and they're completely unsupported, and they're to put all that work on one person, you're kind of setting them up for failure. So I think we really just need to be intentional with what we're trying to do. And so speaking from my own personal experience at my school, we as I mentioned, we do have an Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council, which is made up of a single representative from every equity-seeking association. And what is great about this is when they're all communicating with each other and meeting regularly, they have the ability to really raise concerns and implement change and do that as a bargaining unit because they represent so many students. And part of why we implemented them was to also keep the student government, so they actually keep us accountable. And I think by doing that, we really wanted them to have a really meaningful role that is not held back by, like politics, fear of speaking out, that they have each other. And so it's not just all on one person. But I think, like some of the challenges that comes with that is just like how much more time and effort they have to put into this. They're meeting monthly at minimum. And that's just something that someone who is in a privileged position who doesn't have to think about these things, they don't need to put in that labor. So I think that, these positions can be really, really meaningful when they are supported and when they're given the space to operate, but do it with intention.
Yeah, no, that was beautifully put. Thank you so much for noting that. You put it so well. Thank you. As you mentioned, implementing that sort of meaningful EDI positions that are not going towards tokenism, which is obviously tokenism is not what we as racialized folk would want, especially with considering the amount of labor that has to go into that, as you mentioned as well. And Brenden, you were pointing towards that as well, the idea of like privilege, in that folks that are able to put in that labor and more time and effort, that when it is placed on one person, it ends up being a lot. And it's a lot of labor, but no love and no support. And so when you have that sort of community that you've built in order to sort of bring forward groups of people into that involvement and make sure that everyone is sort of voicing their own opinions, but you have a space for dialogue, is very, very, very important. So thank you for that. Any other final thoughts before we move forward? Yes, Brenden.
Maybe just a quick one, yeah. Because while you were speaking, Deborah, like my brain started churning out and receiving information, churning out new thoughts, I guess. But we'll also like love because you talked about your performance background and the yes, but it's like I know what you're talking about. I've done improv, but also I think what I found was while you were speaking was that it made me think that EDI can be a tool, a tool for transformative change within the institution rather than upholding it. And if it's not being used in that way, that's a red flag for any person in a position of power, because we have to, remember that these institutions, decades back, none of us would be in those rooms. And if we're carrying out those same structures today, we're just going to see future generations struggling the same way that we've seen. And I guess within that, within this conference and the sphere that I'm thinking about is that as an Asian individual or Filipino person within these spaces, just kind of mapping out my position within, whenever I sit on a board or a committee and thinking about EDI, how am I going to use that to change just maybe one policy or maybe something else entirely, so that the next cohort of students coming in will see the benefits that we didn't get to experience while we were there. But yeah. So thanks for giving me that thought. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to see that sort of like back and forth. And that's like great to see, especially in interacting with one another, because you mentioned that transformative change is something that we'd like to push for in these student positions. And I think part of that is getting into those student positions in order to make that change. Going back to the idea that student governance and student leadership and points in student and people taking up space in student governance and leadership is very, very important to make those kinds of and institute those kinds of changes. Anyone else have any thoughts to throw out there, popcorn style? No, all right, we'll move forward then. In entering those spaces that are predominantly geared towards the student experience now with significant opportunities for development. So we're gearing more up towards the imposter syndrome part of conversation that we've sort of been alluding to earlier on. Student leaders are often relied upon to represent other students. And so there's a certain weight to that. And it becomes an increasingly tough task, as Alex was mentioning earlier, in those racialized positions and other positions, especially now in my personal case, it was very difficult in online engagement. Now, in managing and acting in support of those students, have there been times when you feel out of place, some might say imposter syndrome, and how have you managed to sort of navigate out of that kind of situation? Molly, I'll draw on you first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when I saw that question of imposter syndrome, I was like, oh, I feel that automatically. I have always kind of felt like there could be someone else doing what I'm doing, and that I'm taking so many different opportunities from all the other Indigenous students at St. FX, and especially the Mi'kmaq students at St. FX as well. But I've realized the more that I'm engaging with the community and with the center, that they're just happy, and as a community we are happy to have that representation. It's hard to get past the fact that in your head sometimes you're like, oh, I'm saying the wrong things. What if someone knows that my experience is a lie and like everything that I'm doing is wrong? And it's not that at all. So I'm trying to find like the words to like describe like how much I feel like towards this all. It sucks. Imposter syndrome sucks because it damages your own feelings towards yourself as a racialized person, and your own success. And like I should be proud of what I'm doing, but I always feel like I should be doing more. And then there's more that I should be doing, and I should make sure that I need to talk to this person and this person before I go and even talk to a board or something like that. So yeah, it's definitely hard to navigate at times.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the fact is that when you hold those kinds of positions, you're always feeling that sort of like, I'm not enough for this space. Or when you go for those kinds of positions, I think it takes a certain person to go for those positions and then continue to feel like they're not doing enough. Even when you are, even just holding out those positions and providing some support towards students, you're always doing more than another person might be in student governance, because it takes a certain kind of person to still be worried about whether you're supporting your students enough when you're in those positions. So I applaud you for supporting your students, for supporting your students, because it's hard. It's a lot, and it's a lot of a labor of love, I suppose. And we started off this conference with one of the opening remarks speakers naming this conference as a labor of love, and I think that we can extend that to student governance and being it is a labor of continuous love and hardship. Brenden, I'd love for you to get in on this as well.
Totally, yeah. Imposter syndrome? Hell yeah. That's so real. Like, I don't even know where to start. I could probably talk about this for like an hour. And I feel like that's something, maybe some of you notice a ramble. Like, that's just me filling in more words because, like, if I stop talking, maybe they'll catch on that I don't know what I'm talking about. But I don't know. I'm even like right now, I'm feeling it for sure. And I haven't been part of student governance this past year. My sort of tenure in that was from 2016 to 2020. So I've had this year of reflection on what those experiences looked like, what they felt like, what do they mean, what were the outcomes, what did I put into it, and that question always came up in my mind. You know, maybe there's someone better for this. In the year of reflection, then there's this new question that came into my mind, like, oh, maybe there's someone worse for this too, and like I had to see both sides of that. And oftentimes when I talked to some of my colleagues and friends, and they were counting themselves out, possibly like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do it, maybe I shouldn't do it. I always reminded them that like you want that better person to run for those roles, they can't get there unless you run, because that worst person is going to do it first. They always do. And those are the ones who are hungry for power. Those are the ones who are, like rich white students who are seeing an opportunity and like want to cling to the institution rather than support students. Not to blanket a whole group of people, but I've seen that happen in the past. And not to say that we can't find people, can possibly change in these roles and learn things. But there's just so much missed opportunity when it comes to BIPOC folks who are seeking leadership, who come from experiences that they want to see better things for their community. And that's something that I think about. One more thing on the imposter syndrome that I think would be worth mentioning is that when I was serving as an executive on my student union at the University of Winnipeg, where I felt most fake or not real as a leader was in those meetings with a board of regents or Senate meetings with administrators and faculty, because no one there looks like you, or you just don't feel like you belong. And where I felt most real and genuine and I felt my truth as a student leader was when I was with students and engaging them and helping them, supporting them, providing advocacy, being with them on committees where they were needed, where they required support from their student union, and trying to bridge those two spaces. What I began to tell my colleagues and then people who also ran after me and people that I supported is that whatever meeting or room you go into at a university, whether it's from the Board of Regents to an advocacy meeting to a student group meeting, you're there to represent students. So when you're at those Board of Regents meetings, know that you're the most important person in the room, because they wouldn't have jobs without you and what you do for students and the students who are funding their paychecks. And so if they don't want to listen to you, they're not hearing the information that they need to know, which is that students are asking for this. And if you're not giving it, then you should be the one to step down and get someone else who can do it. Because at the end of the day, we're here to provide education to those who are seeking it out. And if they're not going to hear to listen to students, they're failing at their job.
No, 100%. What struck me the most is when you said you're the most important person in those spaces. I think that's impactful, definitely, because in meeting with administration, it's often really nerve-wracking because you know that either you're the youngest person there, or you're the most racialized person there, or you're the most. For me, it's always I'm the only hijabi in the room, and so it's I immediately take into consideration what my place is in the room. But as you mentioned, they wouldn't have jobs without you. And they wouldn't be able to do their job without us advocating for our own. And to the point of imposter syndrome, I think that's one of the kinds of workshops that we spoke about a lot in the Faculty of Arts. And we used to have career workshops around how do we get over imposter syndrome. And it was always write out a list of your accomplishments and just take that in, because even just attempting to access school, you've accomplished a lot. And not only in your life, but also in schoolwork, in your personal life, in the varying avenues, because you're not just a student, you're also a person. And so in those situations where you may feel out of place, it's very important to take care of yourself and remember that you are a person, and that if you need help, you can reach out to someone in order to get that help if you have the avenues to do so. Now, does anyone else want to jump in on this question of imposter syndrome? No.
I'll jump in.
All right. Wow, Deb, absolutely. Thank you.
So I think I need to provide some context and say that when I was meeting with Natasha to discuss this panel, I said, do not give me this question. I do not want to talk about this question. But hearing Molly and Brenden speak, I think a lot of things resonated with me. And the reason I didn't want to speak on this topic is because I feel like I have such a conflicted relationship with this concept. It is something that has definitely been very real for me in my life, but also something that I've actively been fighting and trying to unhinge. And I think I was just afraid that to try and investigate this and go deep into this would bring up those feelings of imposter syndrome that I made myself believe that I have thrown behind. And so I didn't want to engage with this question. But I think the truth is it still exists a bit. I don't know if you can ever fully escape from it. But I think there are more important things than imposter syndrome. And I think that is why I actively try to voice my opinion when I feel like it needs to be voiced.
Yes, no, absolutely. Yes, Molly, you have something to say.
I just wanted to note, I find it really interesting the fact that like all of us being racialized people, how we all have like experienced imposter syndrome in some way, because I always wondered if it was just something that I felt, but I just wonder if it's like an act of like colonization or like feeling like we have to be someone that we're not. I don't know. I just find that really interesting that we all experience that in some way.
No, absolutely. And it's something where, it's not even consciously told to you in some cases. In other cases, it's very consciously told to you that you don't belong in a particular space. But it's interesting to see that we all have those similarities. And I say we because Alex also mentioned it earlier on in this conversation, and I can relate to it as well. In feeling that, again, you don't belong. But in those cases, you have to remember that you do. You are alive and therefore you matter. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And thank you so much, everyone, for your consistent back and forth. I'm loving the conversation that we're having here, and I'm really upset that our session is almost, but not quite, over. Now, my next question is very much pointing towards privilege. And now we spoke about privilege a little bit earlier. Brenden, you were also mentioning it in the access of certain people towards their places. And I will ask everyone to speak onto this question as our sort of, as everyone's also mentioned a little bit, it's kind of touched on it a little bit here and there. Now, involvement in student governance and leadership is a privilege, to say the least. It means that we have access to avenues of involvement that other folks might not have. And we have to acknowledge that even within this space that we've created here as well. Now, how can we encourage students with varying intersecting factors, whether that be race, gender, class, geopolitical location, to get involved? And is that something that we should be saying to them? Of course, sometimes it's in the case of advocacy within the university, this includes the inaccessibility of certain conversations surrounding academia as well. And I'm not sure if you folks have had this experience, but speaking as a master's student, my first class, I left and I was crying. And I reached out to some of my friends who were in their master's programs, and I was like, hey, is it just me or am I dumb? Because I don't understand what anyone has said in this conversation right now, and I'm pretty sure I just graduated like last May. And I'm still in that sort of mindset of academia, but I don't understand anything. And so how can we make spaces of student government and also spaces of schooling safe for racialized folks and folks of varying intersectionalities? Now, I didn't write out a little way of how to navigate this conversation. So if anyone has their thoughts together, you can just pipe on in. Molly.
Yeah, hi. Okay. Yeah, I definitely feel like reaching out to equity seeking groups is the best way to get them involved. I found working in the Indigenous Center, Indigenous folks at the school didn't feel comfortable really coming into the student union building because of the experiences that they had in there. So bringing, student government people into the center and sitting down and having a conversation where it's like, your opinion matters, and I want to hear it, what can I do for you, is really, really important, as well with just educating in classes and stuff like that, that, to not just teach that white Eurocentric point of view on everything. And I feel like those are two really good ways to make racialized groups of people feel a lot more comfortable in their school, and to let them know that they matter and that their voices matter as well. Because I feel like that's the huge issue, is that I do feel like a lot of the times racialized people feel like their voices are just a token to the school. And once, they share their view, then it's out of the way, and now let's get back to everything else that we need to do. So I feel like it's that long-term commitment that you matter and your voice matters.
Absolutely, 100%. It's a long-term commitment to ensure, as you mentioned, that students feel like their voice matters. And especially, I like what you said about steering away from Eurocentric views. Now, I started off this conversation by saying that I'm Pakistani, and most of my family comes from Pakistan. We're all farmers, and so, as you can imagine, not a lot of us living out in the village learned how to read. And so, my Dada Abu's Abu, so my great grandfather, he didn't know how to read, and yet my Abu is consistently telling me, like, hey, like, this is what he used to do. But the conversation is always veering towards forgetfulness, because now he's so old, and we're losing bits and pieces of our history. And so that oral sort of history is being lost. And remembering that those kinds of histories are very valid and not Eurocentric whatsoever is required to be able to build that kind of community back up. And reaching out to equity-seeking groups is definitely very, very important in order to include them into the conversation. I'm hoping I rambled enough so that someone else has their thoughts together. Just a little, who's up next? Who has a thought that they can provide to the conversation? Yes, Deb.
Thank you, Molly, for starting off this conversation. I want to follow up on actually some points that Molly raised. So as I mentioned earlier, my school is extremely new. I'm part of the first cohort, and our school, one of the tenets, if you will, of it is equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think that a lot of students who ended up in our law school were drawn to the school because of that. I know I personally, that was the reason why, one of the main reasons I applied to my law school. And so I think when it's not, like EDI is not just just something that's added to a list of things that are attractive about our school, but it's actually central to our school. Not only does it create that space, but it empowers students to also engage. And so our student government, like, that is a main tenet of ours. That's why we have an EDI council. I think that's why there are so many students who are actively trying to create space on campus. We're a really small school. We have just over 300 students, but there are over 40 organizations, all with at least 2 to 5 leaders. And that means a lot of students are student leaders at our school. And I think people are empowered to do so because it's at every level. There is a commitment from the school as a whole, as well as from the administration, from the faculty. And so everyone feels empowered to make space safe, and to just make space.
Definitely, making that space is incredibly important, especially in situations where you're in a post-grad sort of arena of involvement, where the people that you're meeting are on varying levels of their sort of personal lives and where they are at in that sort of space as well. And I love what you said about the commitment from the school as an institution to be empowered in order to make students feel empowered, and make those spaces safe, which is incredibly important. Now, I also want to point to the fact, now we've been talking about EDI for a lot, and I know that sort of centered our entire conversation, but there are intersections between gender and class that are also very important to discuss within concepts of involvement as well, because as you're all involved, you know that there's a lot of time that is used in involvement positions where the time that is used is often can't be diverted to working or having to engage in childcare and child rearing or any of that sort of idea as well. Now, what can we do to include those folks as well into the conversation? How can we make it an inclusive environment to make sure that folks know that their needs are incredibly important and need to be taken into consideration as well? it's hard, right? And it's something that we consistently. Brenden, did you have a thought, or were you just moving along?
I've just this example and how it can get tied up in like sometimes bureaucratic politics where, for example, at the University of Winnipeg, there was a time where there was a year-long debate of just installing just small details like installing change tables in the bathrooms for students to use if they had a child or whoever needed them. And the student union felt like it's the university property, they should pay for them, it should just get done, let's get it done next month. And this back and forth over a year happened, and I think it got to a point where the student union's like, this needs to happen, it should come from the university, but we'll pay for them because it needs to happen now. And that was, I think, a bit of a failure on the part of the student union because it took a year, and that whole year, basically, there was washrooms where people didn't have access to those change tables. And so that's or student organizations can get caught up into the messiness of those things. And I want to go also one step ahead of this conversation of privilege and student governance and say that when I was working and doing that work, and I thought a lot about this as well, my conclusion to that is that on the one side of the privilege and the top of the spectrum of student leadership, holding a position as a student leader, chairperson, president, or whatever, the other end of that spectrum doesn't just end with the student. To me, it ends with those who aren't in university, and because there's a reason. And so, how do we break those barriers down? So even as a student who's first year, there's privilege there because you got in, and maybe it has something to do with your experience and secondary school and your grades because other things are going on in your life, or it could be because of financial restraint, or it could be because, like this, so things always trickle down. And I always had that on my mind when I had meetings either with administrations or with our MLAs or MPs and talking about fight for education isn't just a fight for students, it's a fight for education across this country and how it needs to be accessed by anyone. Not everyone has to go, but it has to be an option for someone to do. It can be used as a tool to escape poverty, to work in a career that you're comfortable and you want to do, or whatever that may be. So.
No, that was excellent. I don't even think I need to rephrase that. I think that was just perfect. Absolutely, 100%. There is a necessity on the part of those who hold positions of power beyond student leadership to be able to make those spaces accessible to students. And what you mentioned about change tables, I know that there are other smaller ones that I'm not going to mention because this conference happens to be in Toronto. But there are other universities that also have had issues in implementing small changes, whether that be providing pads in bathrooms or just providing safer bathrooms at all, or safer spaces so that students don't have to feel scared and walking to and from certain universities in varying areas around the GTA, the Greater Toronto area as well. Does anyone have any final thoughts as we're about to wrap up before I make my closing remarks? No, all right. Well, thank you all for all of. Oh, you looked like you were about to say something, Brenden.
I just wanted to say thanks to everyone, like Molly, Alex, and Deborah, because I learned a lot and I appreciated this reciprocal space of learning.
This has been an excellent panel, and I've really enjoyed being able to moderate for you folks. You folks are absolutely wonderful and are making, obviously, very amazing points throughout the entire conversation from beginning to end. And I just want to take a moment at the end of this session for just some final remarks, just a couple of thank yous. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Brenden, for coming out tonight. I know it's an hour and 15 minutes, and we were all super nervous. I don't know if you folks in the audience know this, but we were all chatting right before the session. My hands were shaking. We were all sort of like, oh my gosh, I don't know how this is going to go, but I'm really glad that we made this space really comfortable to be able to have this dialogue, because it is incredibly important to be able to, chat with students from across Canada. And I know we don't have someone from every province here and territory, but we have a couple. We have a start. So perhaps the next time we put together this kind of conversation. We can include some more folks into the conversation as well. So I had a blast chatting with you folks, and I'm sure that the audience can agree that you've been an absolute delight to listen to and an absolute delight to hear from all of your diverse opinions as well. And it's been really, really awesome. And so to end off the session, I want to draw from my queen, Rana, in speaking to all of the students in this room, the ones in this particular room and beyond. I don't think that whether you're involved or not, I'm going to start quote here. I don't think you get celebrated enough. And you should be celebrated for every aspect of your growth and your growing pains. You should be celebrated for your creativity, for your fearlessness, for your persistence and determination. And you should be celebrated for all of the effort that you put into building your future. And with that, I will see all of you in plenary panel number 6. Assalamu alaikum.